Hello and welcome. Thank you for joining us. It's a welcome from me, Michael Scott in Oxford in the UK, and from my joint convener, Sanford J. Ungar in Washington, DC, to the 27th jointly promoted event between the Future of the Humanities Project and the Free Speech Project. The latter is sponsored by Georgetown University and the former by Georgetown's Humanities Initiative in association with Campion Hall, Oxford, and the Las Casas Institute for Social Justice, Blackfriars Hall, Oxford. Together, the two projects consider issues concerning human dignity, rights, cultures, histories, traditions, and freedoms in a wide spectrum of educational activity, policy, expression, and aspiration. In a moment, I'll hand over to Sandy, who is the director of the Free Speech Project. He will introduce today's distinguished guests and moderate the ensuing discussion before I return to chair the question and answer session. From the start, you can type in questions to the panel by using, please, the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen. Please do not use the chat button. These questions will come to me during the session, and I will try and put them to the panel in a logical order to consider. We urge you to ask questions as and when they occur to you so that there's not a backlog or crush at the end. Now, over to you, Sandy.
Thanks very much, Mike. And we're certainly happy to welcome our loyal audience to the first of these programs for 2023. We will be doing them once a month, generally this year on Wednesday. And we are happy to carry on this recent tradition of ours. We have with us today four very interesting, varied, and distinguished commentators on environmental issues. We're coming back to the climate crisis for the second time in this series. Good time to check up and see if there's been progress. Back with us from the last time is Astrid Caldas from the Union of Concerned Scientists, originally from Brazil, I believe, and a thoughtful researcher on these topics. Also with us is Constance McDermott, who is at Oriel College in Oxford, and particularly concerned with land use questions, deforestation, and how the climate crisis is affecting the earth that we live on. Also, Richard Staley from Cambridge University and also the University of Copenhagen. Busy man, I think. And we appreciate him being with us. And also Charlie Holt from Greenpeace, a legal expert. And he's going to explain a little bit to us about what Greenpeace is trying to do to prevent the environmental movement from being stalled in court around the world. So I think we need to begin with an overview question about whether there has been recent progress. There were some impressive reports out of the last COP session in Egypt saying there'd been some side agreements. There's going to be some progress. There were in the north thousands and thousands of people gathered there to talk about the environment. Obviously, a sign that's a popular issue that many people are concerned about. But what are the practical results of COP? I think it was 27, if I'm not mistaken. Astrid, could you start us off on this?
Certainly. Thanks for having me. Hi, everybody. A COP is always complicated, right? Because there is always some people who are fighting for one thing, some people who are fighting for another, and yet some people like the lobbyists, oil and gas lobbyists, who are a large contingent at these meetings, and they are lobbying for keeping fossil fuels, in the mainstream, while everybody else wants to remove them. So this COP had a lot of good progress, not the least the loss and damage agreement that was signed there. It's a very important step. That was the issue for COP27, as many see it, because the Global South and climate justice activists have been really fighting for it. So the establishment of a fund for loss and damage to vulnerable countries is a big development. And I would mention a second thing, which is the reinforcement of removal and scaling down coal use, but no scaling down was mentioned of use of oil and gas. So we need to add oil and gas to that scale down so that we can ramp up renewables and make it really the just transition to clean energy that's needed.
Richard Staley, how much time do we have to make more progress? We've been hearing about this for, well, quite some time, some of us, all of our adult lives by now. And there are occasionally optimistic pronouncements, and then seems like we go back to the same problem.
Absolutely,
Richard?
it does. And it's very hard to know what we should do when, but COP itself has tried to set timelines. And if one mentions one of the most important timelines they set, in 2015, they said that emissions should be halved by 2030 to attempt to keep the Earth under a 1.5 degree temperature rise. And that's a clear goal and a clear timeline. And if one thinks about from 2015 to now, we're halfway along. Emissions should be halved, but emissions are still rising. So that's, I think, probably the most worrying picture of the question of progress. Emissions are still rising.
Constance, your concern is that without doing something about deforestation, we're really not going to be able to say we're making progress. I wonder how you assess where we stand right now in that regard.
Well, I might state it a little bit differently.
Okay.
I think it is very well known now that deforestation and land use change is a major contribution to emissions. And it can't be ignored. I mean, we're talking about estimates of, maybe 12% of emissions from deforestation or 24% from land use, depending on, which report you refer to. Of course, the amount of emissions coming from forest loss is proportionate and, to how much fossil fuel emissions are being emitted. So to some extent, it's understood that that contribution is going to decrease over time. So I guess what I would say is, yes, land use and forest loss is an important part of the equation, but it is a very complex also part of the equation that involves fundamental issues around land rights and rights to resources and who gets to make decisions about how land and forests are used. So I think there's a real risk. Sometimes we talk about it, those of us who have been working on issues of deforestation and land conservation for a long time, and local development of sort of climatizing the problem and not seeing how the sort of underlying drivers of forest loss. And so, for example, what we see then is that was particularly COP26 last year, a very ambitious pledge to just, halt deforestation and land degradation by 2030. So it almost feels like a bit of a pledge Olympics, because so far, actually, the progress, yes, I mean, the progress in even slowing deforestation has been, very underwhelming. So it makes us, I think, need to kind of step back and think, well, maybe we need to look at these problems in somewhat of a different way.
Charlie Holt, one of your tasks at Greenpeace, as I understand it, is to deal with so-called SLAP lawsuits. And I wonder if you could give us a concise description of what they are and what kind of problem they present in the whole environmental struggle.
Yes, I'll try and be as quick as possible. I mean, we can start with the handy acronym, which is SLAP, which was coined by two US academics in the 1980s. And just to unpack that, SLAP stands for Strategic Lawsuits Against Public Participation. It's a very clunky way of saying something very simple, which is an abusive lawsuit, which is filed with the purpose of shutting down criticism and effort and accountability. And it's something that we see on the growth and it's continued to grow over the last few years in the US, but globally. And as you say, Sanford, it's something which we've seen targeting environmental defenders, just as it's targeting other public watchdogs. And public watchdog is a term we use to cover all those whose function it is in society to hold the powerful to account. So it can encompass journalists, campaigning organizations, and so on. But environmental defenders have, since the 1980s, when George Pring and Penelope Kainan were first looking at this, they've always been one of the primary targets of these SLAPs. Indeed, Pring and Kainan identified a growth in SLAPs and attributed that growth to the growth of environmental groups such as Greenpeace and Friends of the Earth in the 1970s. We continue to see that in countries around the world, in the US, in the global south, and where I'm operating now in Europe, where we've built a coalition called the Coalition Against SLAPs in Europe, or CASE.
And are you making progress?
Yes, I like to think so. CASE was set up in 2020, early 2020. We actually convened 54 organizations about 6 weeks before the first lockdown. So we just got in there to be able to mobilize civil society across Europe. It's now been growing and growing. There are more than 200 groups who are involved in some way in the coalition, but it has a number of different parts to it. It's working on anti-SLAP advocacy, so pushing for anti-SLAP laws. Those are laws which are designed to dispose of SLAPs as quickly as possible and ensure that those who are targeted have the compensation they need, and that those who are filing it have the sanctions that are needed to deter the use of SLAPs. We've also been working on campaigning, anti-SLAPs campaigns, so exposing SLAPs and those who use them through efforts to name and shame those responsible. And finally, we've been working on legal resilience. So increasingly, we have been able to build mechanisms to support those who are most exposed to SLAPs. And that's an ongoing process. It's something that we're really prioritizing this year and have been identifying certain problem countries where there's a real issue and where there's a real gap in capacity.
I'd like to, thanks very much for that. I think that helps us understand one of the relatively newer tactics on the part of environmentalists to deal with these lawsuits. I'd like to invite several people to weigh in on this question. When you look at advertising, especially in glossy magazines, sometimes on television, other places from corporations, you would think that they are in the vanguard of the environmental movement. The photographs they use, the messages, the music, what have you. And the more one starts to dig into this, the more one gets a very different impression of leading corporations, especially energy corporations and some others. And so to what extent is the corporate sector a major, I don't really like to use the word villain, but maybe you can talk me down from that word, Astrid, but to what extent do we have to hold the corporate sector responsible for saying yes, but acting no?
You can use bad actors or villains, that's
okay.
That's what we use at the Union of Concerned Scientists. We call them bad actors. And the oil and gas companies, it's the corporations, anybody who is involved not only in misinformation, but also those who are, in fact, trying to greenwash their actions by using some code words, by using some catchy lyrics, as you said, the music and the environment shows a beautiful forest, and we are making energy accessible for all. We are making the world a better place. And in the background, you are thinking, wow, we are extracting more oil, and now we are burning and emitting more, CO2 into the atmosphere. So they play a huge role. At my organization, the Union of Concerned Scientists, we have a specific program that goes after some of these people with lawsuits and with accountability requests. There has been briefings, there have been in Congress calling some of these corporations to, what are you doing? Asking them to explain themselves about their activities. But greenwashing, as we call it, is a huge thing, and not only corporations. A lot of places, a lot of organizations also do a lot of greenwashes. And I'm not going to say nonprofits don't do it, because they do. They said they do it in a variety of ways. And, sometimes it's not as visible as the impact from oil and gas, but to say that you're doing something for the environment when you're not actually doing it is just as bad. So yeah, we got to hold those corporations and those accountable for sure.
Constance, do you want to weigh in on this?
Sure. So it's now known in the past couple decades or so that the leading driver of forest loss is the production of global commodities like palm oil and soy, and pasture expansion to produce beef, cocoa, and coffee to some extent. And it's particularly what they call enterprise-driven deforestation, so involving often large multinational companies. And there's a lot of effort to try to address and make this sort of commodity production more sustainable. But I think, again, when I was talking about a step back look at what's going on, it's also important to realize that what we're doing is, in many cases, by focusing on this idea of a green company and sustainable commodities, we're supporting a type of production that really mostly feeds into processed food products and meat products, et cetera, and often in the process displacing local populations. A lot of even the sort of conservation measures attempting to address this deforestation by global commodities are actually serving to sort of squeeze out smallholders and other sorts of production systems locally. So yeah, there's a real sort of tension within the environmental movement. To what extent do you work with companies and sort of say, okay, sustainable commodities are important revenue generator, important part of economic development, and let's work with them as the sort of answer to sustainability. And to what extent do we need to really rethink how we govern the forest frontier and who should be making decisions about that? Thanks.
Richard, I'm also interested in knowing the disparate impact on different countries, but I'd like you to begin on this corporate angle as well.
Yeah, I think what Constance said is really important, and one of the things that it highlights is that you actually need different kinds of accountability. You need to be accountable on many different levels. In one of those levels, emissions, the one I mentioned before, there was an announcement in COP27. There's a new non-government, non-aligned project called TRACE, which accounts for emissions from different sources in different countries and makes them publicly available. But if you kind of download the file for emissions for a particular country, it's at such a general level that it's really hard to know what's going on. So we need very fine-grained accounts, but that itself is nevertheless important because companies often self-report emissions levels that really don't stand up when you look at actual emissions. So we need to work at them in lots of different ways. And as you say, the questions of inequality and that's national and corporate and individual, etc. They drive through this all the way. One of the things that is in the title of this session is global failures in the fight against the climate crisis. The question of global here is both really important, but also a real problem, because it leads us to focus on big things like temperature alone, when in fact rainfall is going to be just as important for many groups in dealing with climate change in particular areas, and sea level rise will be much more important for others, and so So we need to think of things in a general context, but in so many ways, we need to break that down and understand climate and the problematics in a much more fine-grained way.
Charlie, Greenpeace has changed its tactics over the years as it appears to an outsider. One used to think of Greenpeace as a kind of eco troublemaker. And in some ways, I'm trying to get the right euphemisms so we don't go too far overboard. But you know, I think of Greenpeace people on a lonely ship out there somewhere in the North Sea, causing trouble. But we don't hear about that so much anymore. What are the new tactics to fight against some of the more sophisticated corporate tactics these days?
Yeah, well, I wouldn't say it's changed. I would say it's diversified. And that is, I think it's been a necessary process to keep up with emerging trends and different tactics that have been used by, to use the language Astrid suggested earlier, the bad actors that we have been confronting. It's also a reality simply about how you mobilize people in the modern age. Some of the things that were done in the 1970s were done for the same purpose and to advance the same goals as the communications that are means of communications that are used nowadays. So, for example, in the 1970s, there was the idea popularized by Bob Hunter, who was one of the founders of Greenpeace, of a mind bomb. And that was used, some of the more high-profile actions that took place at sea were done with the purpose of inspiring people around the world to act. Now, the reality of the modern age is that a lot takes place online. And so you will therefore see a lot more being done online, and more online actions and so on. But it hasn't moved away. It hasn't really shifted away from some of these tactics. As I said, it's just diversified. Greenpeace now, and when I say Greenpeace, I mean a network of organizations which operate independently, and therefore they all develop very much their own tactics, their own approach to the climate crisis. And it can encompass, we still have a number of actions that take place on the ships that Greenpeace International operates. But we also see a range of different tools being used. So strategic litigation, for example, is something that we've seen on the rise. We see the Greenpeace has had a growing science unit, for example, growing expertise. There's been more reports that have been published with real rigor and research. And as I said, there have been various different communications devices which have been more closely adapted to the modern digital age.
Thanks, Constance. One term that keeps showing up is IPLCs, Indigenous People and Local Communities, and how they are affected in particular by the climate crisis. Are they speaking effectively for themselves? And maybe you could pause first to define that category of IPLCs.
Yeah, well, thanks. That's a very complex question, Sandy, because I mean, even legally, that can be seen as meaning different things in different countries. I think the general trend, is to recognize certainly that well, the importance of Indigenous people, meaning people who have occupied lands for hundreds of years and have a unique culture separate from the mainstream, as being, playing a very important role historically in sort of land management, conservation, et cetera, but also the importance of recognizing all the other communities of, and diversity of people living in especially forest frontier areas, when we're talking about land use change and deforestation, sort of the frontier of deforestation, if you will. So there are of course challenges because in a lot of countries maybe indigenous peoples are not necessarily recognized by the government. So I think the general approach, again, if we're sort of talking globally, is to use the IPLC term quite broadly to refer to people, living on or near, or in the rural areas, on or near forests, and recognizing that they both are, well, several things. They're both very vulnerable to land use change and also to climate change. They're also, I would say, vulnerable to conservation strategies that don't engage them in their design, because it can be another form of, some people use the term sort of green grabbing of people, of local and indigenous communities losing rights to land and resources because of conservation strategies that are designed without their participation. So I think it is increasingly being recognized that it's really critical to engage with IPLCs. It's not an easy thing to do, but arguably there's no substitute for it. And it's going to look different in different countries, given the complex politics involved.
I can imagine in some cases they feel patronized or condescended to. We'll take care of you. Trust us, and that's not always the result. Astrid.
Yeah, that's not always the case. And of course, I have to bring up Brazil and the Amazon. There are lots of initiatives happening there right now, post Bolsonaro government, and a lot of land grabbing had occurred during the Bolsonaro 4 years of government. And now there are big initiatives funded by the Brazilian government, particularly state government research foundations, to really bring back the ability of local people, including indigenous peoples, to do their sustainable farming, to live their livelihoods the way they used to, and try to prevent them from losing their cultural heritage, and at the same time try to also protect as much as they can from the Amazon. Of course, Constance can say that that's a almost impossible task, but I say we have to start somewhere, and I'm optimistic about the initiatives that I have seen going on in the Amazon and in Brazil in particular.
Are these things that can be turned around? I mean, once a certain part of the Amazon has been ravaged, it seems it would be difficult to restore it.
I'm telling you, the building of the Trans-Amazonica Highway is a great example of Amazon restoration, because the Trans-Amazonica Highway, they would complete, like 10 miles. And when they were working on the next miles, the forest was closing in the first miles that they built. So it was kind of an interesting experiment that was not planned, and that really was a disaster. And that's why the Trans-Amazonica did not happen the way that they planned, and did not happen in the time frame that they planned. So there are certain areas that can recover, but there are certain areas, particularly those that are encroaching from the south for grazing and everything, and changing completely the environment. And you have this, what we call biomes, which is a complete system of plants and animals. If those move in, they probably will take over, because the forest itself takes so long to develop and takes so long to actually be what it is, that those fast growing other environments may be very hard to deter. Right, Constance?
Yes. And then also a lot of uncertainties about how climate change will impact the forests themselves, and sort of conflicting models, but a lot of concern about that and the risk of forest fires and disturbed forests, et cetera. So it is very complex. And also just sort of, building on the idea of the global community as being condescending to indigenous or local communities and knowledge. It can ill afford to do that, given the sort of poor performance so far of achieving these kinds of very ambitious global targets, disembedded from the people most affected by them. So I think, I think one thing I would really plug for is when we have all this wonderful press and about deforestation and how important it is to address it, that hand in hand with that, we realize that comes along with a lot of social obligations and sort of a whole social story behind it that needs to be just as prominent. Otherwise, we come up with solutions that are so unaccountable and disembedded from the context that they're trying to change.
Richard, when the history of this fight is written, what will be the main achievements and the main failings, do you think, of the environmental movement, the attempt to fight climate change?
When you put it like that, one of the immediate things that strikes me is how much the environmental movement has become the enemy of corporate concerns, right? And it's been a great inspiration to look back on Rachel Carson's Silent Spring and the founding of the EPA and the extraordinary changes and developments of a movement with environmentalism at its heart, but also to realize that at the same time as that was being developed and a lot was being achieved, there was a constant opposition in the US, particularly from conservative Republican figures, but who've been aligned against that all the way. And one can see that in the successes of the IPCC, which in some ways took the model of what had happened around pesticide use as a positive example, and some of their failures. Obviously now, the big thing is that it's a much more world-encompassing story, even than Rachel Carson's Silent Spring and pesticide use had been. So the problems are much more intimate and difficult. You can see I don't have a single,
Of course.
figure, but that's the dynamic that I think is really interesting in this. The entwining of promise and threat at the same time, and how closely that's integrated.
I'd like to press you on one point, and maybe others will want to chime in as well. Are there some countries or parts of the world that you feel have done a more effective job at communicating the seriousness of this crisis than others?
Well, I would say probably Middle Europe has been more effective at communicating with its own citizens on lots of different areas and developing policy initiatives and so on that are integrating these questions with their own uses. I think it has important blind spots and it's open to some of the paternalism and so on, but on their ground, I think they're doing quite well. In America, you see some of the great achievements of it, but also the real disadvantages. Britain looks a little bit like it's ready to play in the shadows of these things. Doesn't want, so the Conservative government in Britain has been torn by whether or not it should be green or not green and so on, and it wavers constantly. So you see lots of nuance in those different areas. Others will probably have still more informed views than I do. So I'd be really interested to hear what others think.
I'd like to hear what people have to say too. Charlie, are there some bright spots on the map as you see it?
Well, yeah, I think you can start by looking at which of those countries have declared a climate emergency. There have been 18 national governments and the European Union which have done so. One of those is my country of the UK. I think it's really interesting what Richard's saying about the sort of quite erratic way that we've seen our governments go from backwards and forwards, not quite clear about whether or not they want to play the role of global leader, not really quite sure whether this fits into the mold of global Britain as it's meant to be post-Brexit. But it is true that the UK was one of the first, if not the first, to declare a climate emergency. And I would say, rather than attributing this to the sort of green sympathies of our leaders, it's far more attributable to the climate movement. I think what might not be so clear in the way that Britain has communicated about this in the past is that the climate emergency that was declared a crisis in the UK only following the first wave of Extinction Rebellion protests in the UK. which successfully mobilized so many people that it kind of became unavoidable for the government as an issue. And that was one of the central demands of Extinction Rebellion in this first wave of protest. I would just emphasize there that the reason you have seen movement there has been because of the movement. And I think there's something similar in other parts of the world. I think Spain, for example, has played a very important role in recent years, especially with climate negotiations, which has been somewhat to do with the climate, I think largely to do with the climate movement. I think even in an authoritarian country like Turkey, where there's quite a nascent climate movement, you have seen Turkey's policy become more progressive in line with that, even as it's worked to suppress some of the more disruptive elements of that movement. So yeah, I would just emphasize that point, which is that you do see some countries taking a more progressive line than others, but usually always that can be attributed to the movement on the ground. So it really is worth getting to the streets on this. It does work.
Astrid and Constance, do you want to add to that?
Sure. I mean, I can add that I think it's really important to not just look to governments and what different, especially national leaders are doing, because so much of the interesting action, a bit following on from what Charlie was saying, so much of the important action is not necessarily at the state level. And it's, while that might be disturbing, sometimes it's also hopeful, because as we know, as we've seen happen politically in the US and UK and lots of countries now, you can have radical flips in terms of national leadership and radical change, or Brazil, radical change overnight, where it seems like you've lost everything because you've got a government in place that's not interested in addressing climate or what might have you. So what have you. So again, that sort of perspective that this really needs action at different scales, and that the sort of local level buy-in, the social movements are so critical. And from the deforestation perspective, that national buy-in is very important, but also, it all requires sort of citizen action as well. And civil society plays a very important role in all of this, in sort of motivating action and helping it survive the political craziness your country might go through, the flip and flop of national politics.
Astrid?
Yes, I would add the issue of people experiencing extreme weather events and people experiencing impacts of climate change. It's a huge thing. And as we can see, one of the biggest things for me is the change over the years that we see in climate change impacts perception that has been followed by the Yale program on communication on climate change and George Mason University. These guys have been following the perception of climate change, and it's been amazing how much it has changed from the minority of people in the United States specifically thinking that climate change was not happening, it was not impacting them, to now over 70% or even more at this point of people saying climate change is happening, even though they don't acknowledge that it is human activities or whatever. Some of them do, but that perception and then the agreement that something must be done again for climate change is an important development for me. So bottom up in that sense of the people perception and them talking about it, and then kind of supporting measures for climate change, for greenhouse gas mitigation, as we call it, which is reduction of emissions, and for adaptation to climate impacts that are already here and already happening and that we cannot stop anymore. I think that's big.
That's a good segue to the last point I want to raise before we go to Mike and ask him to tell us about the questions that have come in. I think that from time to time, one can perceive something comparable to what's known in the human rights field as compassion fatigue, that people get worn out by hearing about the terrible things happening in some parts of the world and somehow see other things in their daily lives that are squeezing out something like environmental concerns because they've been hearing about them and they keep hearing about them and they keep hearing about them and rarely get any basis for a pat on the back saying, well, that that iceberg, that glacier did not split after all because of something you did, that we don't get news like that. So sort of a parting thought from our end of this discussion. What about the fatigue over the environmental concerns? Are people coming up with new ways to revive that? Maybe Greenpeace has some new angles on it, Charlie. I don't know. Charlie.
Yeah, sorry. I was just thinking about an answer. I don't think there are any easy answers to that. I think it's something that we're all very conscious of, or at least those who are responsible for mobilization and for engagement. I think there are areas where we can be more hopeful and more optimistic. I think we talked earlier about COP27 and loss and damage. I think that's a good example of that. I gave an example earlier about the declaration of a climate emergency. There are clear examples of where climate movements have had a tangible impact on climate policy. It does happen. Protest and activism does work. And it's important that we emphasize that in the midst of all of this bleakness regarding this, the trajectory that we seem globally to be on. There are ways that we can leverage and put pressure on governments and indeed on private entities and corporations. And I think it's just important to continue to emphasize that alongside the very clear urgency of the problem and the call for action. But that is a huge challenge for everyone who's communicating about climate change in whatever capacity. It can be very easy to foster a sense of defeatism and despair. And it is important to counter that, because there are, as I said, amidst the gloom, reasons to be more optimistic.
And of course, there have been some tactics that have emerged that are very worrisome. I mean, people gluing themselves to paintings and in museums, throwing cans of soup. I'm not sure what they think they'll accomplish, or who will sit up and say, "Aha! Well, if you're going to ruin a Monet painting, then I really understand what's at stake here." Or that seems an indication of desperation that may be hard to come back from.
I mean, I would challenge that slightly. I mean, what it is a very clear signal of the urgency of the situation. It's often misrepresented in the press. These more disruptive tactics are becoming increasingly popular, not just in the UK, but across Europe. We see similar things taking place in Germany and Spain, for example, and they do take different forms. But at the moment, at least, these tactics are much more carefully thought through than they're often presented. So, for example, much of the reporting around the Just Stop Oil protests in galleries suggested or implied that there was permanent damage caused to the paintings, whereas the paintings targeted were behind glass. I say all this in my own personal capacity. These are not the type of tactics which Greenpeace is engaging on. And indeed, Extinction Rebellion has recently come out of a statement to say they'd be backing away from this type of disruptive protest. But I would say that the theory of change that drives them is not that they are going to be very popular as a result of them. It's more a recognition that personal popularity isn't important, that you can engage in these type of tactics and become incredibly unpopular as a result. I mean, there are, stories of people in Germany being spat on and beaten up as they're lying in the middle of the roads, and they know this. These activists go in there knowing that this will be the result and the response of people. But there have been surveys which have been carried out which show that just because people hate the messenger doesn't mean that they change their opinion of the message. And so if you have activists carrying out these type of disruptive activities, it's undoubtedly raising the profile of the message. And so more people hear it, and more people listen to it, more people understand. So I would, in that sense, just say that I think it's more thought through often, these tactics, than they're often presented. And that's not to say that they are always a good idea in any circumstance.
Right. I'm glad we got that point. I see Mike is back, and we'll ask him to curate the questions that have come in.
Fine, thank you very much for a very interesting session so far. A very kind of one question came in right early on from Sue Osler. Hello, Sue. Good to hear from you again. And it's a kind of a what can we do question. And she says, would it help if plastics internationally were all recyclable instead of only some? Often people have a hard time sorting out which plastics are recyclable and which ones are not. So that's somebody obviously going around the supermarket looking at can I buy this or not? What do you think? Is there any move for that kind of thing? Richard?
Yeah, I mean, I recall from a much earlier period in the questions of recycling that Germany made an enormous difference in the number of plastics in IBM computers by making manufacturers take responsibility for being able to recycle and reuse all the components that they used. So you could deliver your computer back to IBM and they would have to then deal with the waste, right? And that led IBM to go from using 21 different kinds of plastics to using 4 plastics in their computers. So that's a brilliant illustration of how important it is. And it shows that you need to get to the producers to do this and that they need to be having a real concern for the plastics that they use.
Yeah. Charlie, do you want to say anything about that? You're going to have a campaign, a Greenpeace campaign on plastics.
I am no expert about plastics. I'm very wary about stepping into this area in case I say something which is wildly contradictory with our own plastics campaign messaging. So I'll be careful. It is interesting, though, about how plastic recycling varies so widely from country to country. And this is something I just say from my own personal experience. I was in the Netherlands beforehand, which recycles considerably more of its plastic than the UK does. And yet it doesn't have, it used to have separate recycling for plastic, and now it doesn't. And that's a lot about how much money they invest in the filtering systems that they have. But again, I have to emphasize I'm not an expert, and I realize this is a complicated area, which I would just implore people to read our reports, which I can post in the chat.
Thanks. Any other comments on that one from anybody? Shall I go on to another one then? It's Alexander Gregg Duarte. Alexandra's put in a few questions. I'll start with the first one. The Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development, OECD, has contributed billions in climate finance, but in large part, this financing comes from loans. Is it fair to consider loans as climate relief? What are the implications of this for developing countries? Again, who wants to take that? You want to try that one, Charlie?
I probably shouldn't have unmuted there because it suggested I'd be best placed to do it. I don't know whether others
yeah, that's it. Yeah, yeah.
Anyway, I would think Astrid would have some thoughts about that.
I really don't. I wish I had my colleague, the economist at the UCS, Rachel Cletus, here, because I'm sure she would have something to say. But I don't really know how the process goes about the loans and how that cascades down to the funds and how it's paid back. So I think that's a much more complex, way above my pay grade.
Okay. Alexandra says, can you speak on the difference between climate adaptation and climate mitigation, which is more urgent?
That I can speak to.
Okay, Astrid.
Adaptation is something that we usually do locally, and for some places it's very urgent because they are already drowning. I mean, drowning, sea level rise or extreme heat or many of the impacts. However, without the mitigation, these impacts are only going to get worse, and whatever measures people take and communities take and states and governments to protect people and property from these impacts are only going to get worse without the mitigation, right? So if you do something, this something in 10 years, 15 years is not going to be protecting anybody anymore because climate change and global warming is getting worse. So we have put things in the context of resilience, which is a word that a lot of people hate, but you get the mitigation, it's needed, it's urgent, because without it, it's not only the people, it's the whole systems and the whole earth that can collapse. And we do not know what is going to really happen. We do the studies on one thing and another, but the interconnected parts, we don't really know. So we need the mitigation and we need the adaptation. I would say mitigation, because it's global and because it impacts everybody, is very important. Adaptation is very important at the local level to protect people, property, nature, etc. So I don't think that one is more important than the other as they work together in tandem to make climate change slow down.
I see people nodding on that. I think that seemed a very comprehensive answer. Thank you. Thank you very much. Sue Wu says, hi, professors. This is a question related to the early discussion about global failure. I am interested in the role of city in fighting the climate change. Do you think it would be a good strategy to address the climate change directly on the level of city instead of on national government? Thank you. So I think what she's saying is we got lots of people flying here, there, and everywhere. The politicians making names for themselves on the back of the climate change. Maybe you may disagree on that, but it does seem to some onlookers that is the case. You know, going to this country, going to that country every year, having a good chat about it at country level. But I think what Sue Wu is saying is, what about looking at it on our immediate and where our city is, on what our city is doing and should do? Wouldn't that be a better thing to do? I wonder, Connie, whether you might have a word to say about that, because Oxford, in a sense, is trying to do that with making it a cycle city and so on and so forth. Would you like to say something about that?
Yeah, well, I mean, I think it speaks directly to that conversation we had along the line there of not just looking to national governments or intergovernmental processes for action. I mean, first of all, even at that level, you know, getting action at national level depends on civil society activism. It depends on all kinds of different levels of action. But also, I think some of the most encouraging and exciting things are happening through, you know, social movements or individual experimentation or different cities. I don't taking action. I don't think it should be an either or, though, because arguably there's no reason that government shouldn't try to talk among themselves and come to agreement, et cetera. But you know, let's hope it doesn't just depend on that. I think things would look pretty grim if that's the case, but it doesn't. I mean, there's so much, and also just generally speaking, I think we see what we look for, and I think there are so many examples of communities and you know, whether it's new or traditional or what have you, and cities who have experimented with different approaches to you know, not just climate mitigation, development, et cetera, and are, you know, arguably doing very well and, you know, conserving their trees and you know, reducing consumption and recycling and everything. But that doesn't tend to get highlighted a lot, because I think there's sort of a political incentive for, you know, a particular, whether it's the UNFCCC or a negotiator, to say that our, you know, big global decision has made this radical change overnight, when in fact, maybe the most, you know, if we look at what's happening and bubbling up in different places and pay more attention to those things that aren't sort of commandeered at a global level, we might find, you know, all kinds of innovation and inspiration at different scales.
Yeah, Richard, have you got any comments on that?
A couple of things. I live in a town that has enormous congestion, although you might not think of that, Cambridge, and there's a big fight now over the introduction of a congestion charge, which is being forecast. One of the things that's often forgotten in the way that's discussed is that the congestion charge is supposed to come in about 2 years after starting to change the infrastructure to allow easier public transport through the system and so on. But that will highlight the complexity of all the parts of that puzzle. And I think it's really important to explain all the parts of that puzzle, because when you just see it as congestion charge, then it's something that almost every Cambridge person wants to say no to. I don't want, and you can see that there've been protests about it. So one needs to deal with all the intricacies in the local level. I also recall seeing papers comparing cities in Britain and Brazil and other South American areas with exactly this question of what can we do at a city level? And one of the things that's interesting in many of those cities is how much the problems are shared. And you could always do a lot with efficiency of public transport. You often find that the most environmentally problematic areas are also those with the highest density of low-income people. There are so many patterns in those areas, and that shows how much power inequalities have driven the way we've formed our communities. So overall, addressing inequality, I think, is the major thing. And that should underlie, as Constance said, addressing the social questions at the same time as one addresses the questions about climate. I think that's really something we should take as an important message from this.
If I may add,
Yeah.
I agree 100%. And I think the examples coming from the cities about how they are dealing with these inequalities and trying to really solve the problems that go across the board, particularly to the low income parts of those communities, right? How do you make that balance? I think that's a great example. Many of those are case studies for implementation of other solutions that come at county level and state level, and eventually help bigger parts of each country. And I mean, we cannot have something that's good for everybody, because each community is different, each state is different, each country is different, right? But I think that it's important to note that even at COP, there are coalitions of cities. There are coalitions of mayors, there are coalitions of states, there are international coalitions of cities that are there lobbying and fighting for what they think is important, because as much as they are doing, they cannot go it alone. As Constance said, you have to have both. Without some federal policy to help state and local governments to really do what they need to do, it's going to be very hard to do the things that are needed to really adapt to climate change and prevent the worst of it and the worst of the impact to the people who cannot really handle it, who are more vulnerable to it. So I think it's very important that the cities are very active. I think it's essential. I think the federal government and state governments have to be paying attention to kind of, direct their policies along the ways of successful actions from the cities.
Thank you for that. Taking it on a little bit from there, Angela Preston, good to hear from you again, Angela. And Angela says, what benefit would it be to have competition between countries, maybe we might also add cities, to reverse climate change, much like, she says, the race to the moon? I know, for example, that I'll come to it. I know, for example, that in waste collection in the UK, that various towns actually are competing against one another to be able to do that in a better ecological way and faster way and more efficient way and so on. And so it's quite an interesting question, that, from Angela. Richard, you wanted to speak?
Yeah, I did want to speak because the question of competition definitely underlines the American approach to new green technologies and the decision to make it so that they will subsidize American technology, but only if everything is manufactured in America. So that immediately sets up what we are having, which is a race to find new anti-climate change technologies and to lead in that sector and to have a competitive advantage in manufacturing those technologies to do better than everybody else. And to me, it's contradictory to the main aims of the problem, the main features of the problem, which is it's a global problem. It affects everybody. You've been affecting all of us, so help us now. So I think competition can only take us part of the way there, and mostly it's probably problematic.
Yeah, Charlie, do you agree with that?
Yeah, I think that's probably correct. I don't think I have much to add other than to say, I think that ultimately this is, and I think it's just a matter of governments waking up, that this is going to be an increasingly important test of how influential a company is geopolitically, and just countries. And I think you are starting, again, reasons to be optimistic, to see some countries recognize that in order to be influential, they need to be a leader, at least in some areas, on this issue. I hope that will continue.
Mike, if I may cut in here for a moment on this matter of the competition, there on many university campuses in the United States, there have been rivalries among different units on the campus, and it's who can throw out the most trash, whose recycling will weigh more than everyone else's recycling. So winning the recycling Olympics, as it were, it goes somewhere, but I think it's very hard to sustain, and it's a little bit simplistic, I would say.
Yeah.
Well, and I think it can also have perverse effects. I mean, and people respond, I guess, differently to the motivation of competing. But I think, as Mike was saying, if we are accepting that we're trying to come up with more inclusive and equitable approaches to addressing climate change, then sort of competition and patenting and sort of appearances over, who recycles more, not considering who's consuming more. I mean, it's too reductionist, I guess, in terms of trying to address the problem.
Yeah.
Good point.
Okay. Let's go to Tala Dawalashi. Sorry about your pronunciation of your name, Tala. How can civil society dismantle the Davos culture, which sets the agenda for many international development organizations, including the UN, the big INGOs, and international development banks? Astrid, you're nodding.
Charlie is on it.
I'm happy to start, and we'll see where we go.
Okay.
I think the first thing I should say is that, the WEF or Davos itself is more of a symptom than the cause of a broader problem, which is the growth of corporate power. There's a very interesting documentary I would recommend to people. It's called The Forum, and it's very interesting because it follows the process of one of these conferences in Davos, and it interviews a range of players, including I've momentarily forgotten his name, the founder of Davos, Klaus Schwab, as well as the head of Greenpeace International, who was attending that. And it really did sort of test and explore, looks into that question about to what extent this is helping or hindering. Personally, I think part of the problem with Davos is it adopts a very much a sort of insider approach to change. That the idea that that there are certain corporations who are already in that power, and I think in so doing it kind of consolidates that power. There's some very interesting parts of that documentary where you see the organizers of the Davos conference, phoning up Shell, for example, the CEO of Shell, and asking them to facilitate a conference with Jair Bolsonaro and others. And, you start being like, is this, in trying to bring certain people on board, are you simply legitimizing them? Are you simply reinforcing their powers? But I would say this, which is that, what we've seen is a growth in corporate power, to the point where, some of the examples I always give is that Shell has, for example, its own State Department. You will have Walmart having an annual turnover which exceeds that of Turkey. You have 69 out of the top 100 economic entities in the world which are corporations and not states. And at some point you have to be realistic, and you say, well, this is the power dynamics with which we're operating, and you have to therefore hold those powers to account and say, well, with that power comes responsibility. And you need to, I think, update international mechanisms for holding power to account accordingly. And so, for example, there is currently pending a draft legally binding instrument on corporate accountability. It's that sort of thing that we need to see, where we really reconceptualize our idea of rights and accountability, and recognize that corporations are able to exercise powers which are comparable to that of states, and they need to be tested and challenged accordingly.
Thanks, Charlie.
And now that Charlie has spoken, and I agree completely, I would have to add a couple of things. First, that I want to go back to the power of the people and the movement. That's important, even in corporate accountability, right? So I think that there is that power there, and if there is the will from the people and there is the demand for accountability, something may happen. I have to be optimistic. I'm an optimist. The second thing that I would like to say is that corporations are in it for money, right? They're not going to be doing anything that's going to reduce, their earnings, So whenever we talk, going back to the greenwashing and everything, whenever we talk about corporations and what they are advocating for, they are advocating for themselves. So there has to be a shift in the corporative world, in that their gains and their bottom line is linked to a better economy that is based on renewables and not fossil fuels, and a lot of other things that climate change is the consequence of, so to speak. Thanks.
Thanks for that. Could ask another question that's come through. We talk about cities, we talk about countries. Who's going to look after the oceans in all this? Because the climate change is hitting the oceans. So who takes responsibility, Richard, do you think, for the oceans?
That is a big and important question. I actually don't know the formal answer, but I do know that there are international bodies that are concerned with the oceans and are monitoring it. And there's quite a lot of climate knowledge about the oceans, and it's no longer, as it once used to be, so centered upon trade routes. A lot of climate knowledge reflects economic priorities and reflects state priorities as to where you can measure different variables, etc. So I think Constance earlier said, you see where you can shine a light, or something along those lines. And commercial interests have driven a lot of what we know. This is a case where we know that now we didn't understand fossil fuels well enough. We know that they damage the environment in ways we had little awareness of. And we know that these are connected with lots of different things that turn out actually to be connected with some of our most problematic social issues. So we need to address all of those things at the same time. And the oceans are very important in that, and they can be a symbol of the ways that these systems are different in different places. The oceans will be perhaps the major impact of climate change will be in sea level rise. There's already quite substantial sea level rise written into what we've done. And if we get it wrong, there will be enormous sea level rises happening really quite fast. That's going to change the face of the Earth. And it's going to make cities redundant in places and, cause lots of migration and things like that. So yeah, we need to pay attention to the oceans. And I wish I knew the body that's doing that. I'm sure they would say that they're doing everything that you need, but I'm sure also it's enmeshed in the same problematic interrelation of commercial and state interests.
I would like to add, you think it's going to be something of substance, but I want to say that Richard has a sea level rise mug that he's drinking from. Isn't that a sea level rise mug?
That's right. Yeah.
It is. I know.
I was drinking cold water in it, but if I had poured in hot water, then you would see the coastlines changing.
Yeah, that mug, I have one. I noticed it. I think that's a big point, because sea level rise is something that happens slowly and affects the whole world. You cannot underestimate the impact of the Arctic and the Antarctic, the melting of the ice there, the land ice there, and really, it's coming already, and we have a lot of it already baked in, right? So we have to really pay attention to that.
Connie, do you want to say a final word on that before we close?
Well, I mean, it isn't really my central area, though we have a lot of students here and graduate students here among others who are really keen on understanding ocean politics. And let's just say it's a very, very difficult area. It's politically very fraught, especially with now the sort of growth of things like deep sea mining. When it comes to fisheries, we've not done a very good job of being able to agree among countries who has rights where, or act on sort of what might seem like a simpler problem, and because global fisheries are in very bad shape. So I think that, maybe you could say, well, that is a case when it comes to oceans where, again, it's the environmental problems are social problems. It's a matter of how well can states and people and governments, et cetera, work together to try to address problems that are affecting everyone. So yeah, we're looking for good ideas there and good new energy to address that very challenging problem of.
Thanks, Connie. With that, I'm going to have to bring you to a close. Charlie's had to go off to take an urgent phone call, so we thank him. But Sandy, do you want to say anything before I close the event?
Just a few words. I'm very happy that we've had this conversation a little bit after COP and putting it into perspective. I wouldn't say I come away a lot more optimistic than I began, but I am very impressed by the level of analysis and thought going into these issues. So thank you all, Connie, Astrid, Richard, and of course, Charlie as well, for participating today. This is just exactly what we try to do, and especially to reach across boundaries and talk about common international problems and how well people are being able to speak up and publicly about them. So thank you, Mike. Always a pleasure to collaborate with you. We'll be back on Wednesday, February 15th, actually talking about Brazil and the failure or the threats to democracy there. First of a series of country-specific programs that we'll be doing in the months ahead. So thanks to everyone who backs us up. John McCabe, our program manager at the Free Speech Project, Maggie Scott, and others in Oxford who do so much to keep us running. And I hope everyone will continue tuning in over the months ahead. Back to you, Mike.
Thanks, thank you, Sandy, and thank you, Astrid, Connie, and Richard, and Charlie, of course. I'd like to mention that yesterday we had a discussion about climate change in relation to insects, in relation to the environment on the Bent and Beautiful World Literature, Arts and Environment series, which we do with Georgetown University. And that's there on the web or on YouTube to have a look at. And it was an absolutely fascinating discussion. So please tune into that. You can get information from the Georgetown website for that. That same series has got an event also on January the 31st, when Nathan Hensley from Georgetown University will be talking about J.M.W. Turner's Burning World. And in the following week, the following one from that, there's a fascinating one with one of the world's top viola players, who's going to talk about his instrument as a piece of nature, formed from nature, which will play about nature. That's Graham Oppenheimer, and that'll be about in a couple of weeks' time. So look out for that one as well. My thanks as well to everyone at Georgetown, to those at Blackfriars, John O'Connor, the Regent, Richard Finn, Director of the Las Casas Institute at Campion, Nick Austin, the Master of Campion Hall, and Ying Campion Hall administrators. I'd like to mention Laura Lees, my publicist here in the UK. And thank you for attending today, for all the support for our various series. We do appreciate that. And my thanks again to Sandy and to the Free Speech Project that joined up with the Future of the Humanities Project. I'm Professor Michael Scott, Fellow and Senior Dean at Blackfriars Hall, Oxford. You can follow me on Twitter at MikeScottProf. Until next time, take care, keep safe. Goodbye. Thanks, everybody. Bye-bye.